Thank you, everybody, for coming today to the Psychiatry Grand Rounds. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor and Dr. Volker Roelcke to our department. He joins us from Hamburg, sorry, not Hamburg, Frankfurt, where I think it's about 9 o'clock at night. We've been friends for over 35 years, and during that time, Volker completed his psychiatric training, earned his Habilitation, roughly equivalent to our Ph.D., and then moved through the ranks of academic medicine to become a professor of the history of medicine and chair of the Institute for the History, Theory, and Ethics of Medicine at Giessen University. Some of his areas of active research have included history of psychiatric research in the early and mid-20th century, and the politics and epistemology of human subjects research. And to my mind, I think that his research has carried the very special imprint of his training in psychiatry and anthropology. Dr. Roelcke has been awarded a number of honors, including election into the Leopoldina, the German National Academy of Sciences. He was also the founding co-chair of the Lancet Commission on Medicine, Nazism, and the Holocaust, which was the report of which was released in 2023. And Robin will put a copy of the report in the chat before the end of the presentation. As a physician and as a psychiatrist, Dr. Roelcke is a member of our professional tribe, and he speaks with authority on who we are, what we have been in the past, what we are becoming. And I think in this talk, he will describe the worldview of German psychiatry in the early mid-20th century and how it related to the then emerging worldview of Nazism. There will be possible implications that are drawn out for our current time, but without further delay, I would like to cede the Zoom platform floor to Dr. Roelcke. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's a great pleasure to talk to you and your colleagues. And well, I'm trying to share my presentation. All right. Yeah, so during the last 15, 20 years, one of the really main focuses of my work was medicine and in particular psychiatry during the Nazi period, and also the implications of the Nazi period on post-World War II medicine, psychiatry, and also on bioethics. And both of that is the topic of my talk now. I think for me, there's a guiding question to the whole field of inquiry in question here. This is, why is the confrontation with psychiatry during the Nazi period relevant for psychiatry and bioethics today? It's not only sort of historical interest just to know what happened in the past, but it has nothing to do with today. But to my understanding, it has quite a lot to do with medicine, psychiatry today. I have two, in a way, hypotheses why this, which are the baseline of what I'm going to argue. What happened in psychiatry during the Nazi period was not specific for this period, is my argument, but may rather be understood as an extreme manifestation of problematic potentials inherent in modern psychiatry and in medicine in general. And the second hypothesis, that the behavior of psychiatrists during Nazism illustrates the most extreme forms of opportunism and abuse of power on the one side, but also, and this is in a way the positive thing about it, this illustrates the potentials and also the conditions of resistance and resilience in the face of threats, force, and inhumanity. Well, let me give you a very, very brief sketch of the context, of the historical context of what happened to psychiatry, to psychiatrists during the Nazi period. As you probably all know, the period of Nazism or National Socialism lasted only 12 years, but a very decisive and, of course, destructive 12 years, from 1933 to 1945. Before the onset of National Socialism, there was a short period in which Germany was a democratic republic, the so-called Weimar Republic, because Weimar was the place where the constitution was drafted. This was from 1918, the end of the First World War. This was the demise of the German imperial state until 1933, so 15 years. But in these 15 years, there were grave economic problems already since the beginning of this democratic state, mainly due to reparation payments after World War I. And these economic problems intensified after the 1929 stock market crash and world financial crisis, and led to very, very high unemployment and massive cuts in public spending, which again resulted in political divisiveness and dissatisfaction and hate and so on the streets in the period from 1929 to 1933. But still in 1933, there was still a democratic sort of constitution, and the Nazi government came to power after formally correct elections in 1933. I think that's an important point to see. There was not a military coup or anything else, but there were formally correct democratic elections. The Nazi party had only about 25 or 30% of the votes, and they needed two other conservative parties who were prepared to cooperate with them. So there was a coalition between these two conservative parties and the Nazi party. And the conservatives had the idea that they would easily sort of outmaneuver the Nazi party, but it turned out the other way around. The Nazis managed to outmaneuver the other parties, and within a very short time managed to create an dictatorship, if you want. They immediately started the massive stigmatization and persecution of those they classified as Jews. Many of these people actually didn't understand themselves as Jews, but they had certainly Jewish parents or grandparents, but they were Catholics or they were agnostic or whatever. But they were classified as Jews. And there was another group, smaller group, which were also stigmatized and persecuted. They were stigmatized as politically unreliable. And this was mainly people, members who were members in the Social Democratic Party or in communist organizations and so on. Well, in the first 6 years of this Nazi period until 1939, the regime pursued health, social, and population policies as racial policies to strengthen the so-called folk body. And they also prepared the country for envisaged war. And in the second 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, this war was initiated, and in this period also the regime tried to achieve the so-called final solution of the Jewish question, or what is now called the Holocaust or the Shoah. Altogether, in these 6 years, 12 million people were killed. So that's the broader context. If we look at psychiatry during the Nazi period, we can identify 4 subtopics, if you want, which I have here ordered in a chronological way. First, the consequences of the Nazi takeover for physicians, including psychiatrists. And here we have again 2 subtopics, if you want. There was initiated from the government procedure called Gleichschaltung, or forced coordination, of all public and academic institutions, also medical institutions and medical associations. This forced coordination implied that the government appointed the leader, so-called leader, of any organization, like the dean of a medical school, and the dean from top down appointed all other functionaries. So in contrast to the system in the Weimar Republic, where you had elections from bottom up, like members in a medical association, they elected their board or their president. But now the system was that all the functionaries were appointed from above, from the top. And this occurred in all sorts of organizations in the public sphere and also in universities, medical schools, medical associations, and so on and so on. But it does not imply that all of those appointed to certain offices were necessarily members of the Nazi Party. They just had to fit the expectations of their immediate superiors. And the second subtopic in a way is that the regime pursued policy of stigmatization, persecution, and forced migration, and finally also systematic extermination of psychiatrists who were defined as Jewish or politically unreliable. This started with the expulsion of physicians and psychiatrists from public medical institutions like universities or communal hospitals and so on. Those who were identified as Jewish, they could still, in the first months, they could still work in private practice, but then the license to work in private practice was withdrawn from them. And finally, they were not allowed to call themselves physicians or doctors anymore, but they had to call them themselves health providers or something like that. Yeah, so that happened in the first 6 years of the regime. And also from the beginning, as I already said, there was a systematic policy or policies aimed at the strengthening of the so-called Volkskörper or folk body. These policies lasted through the whole period from 33 to 45. It started with the law for forced sterilization, a eugenically motivated law, which led to the sterilization of roughly 360 to 400,000 individuals who were diagnosed by physicians as suffering from hereditary disorders. So the law was formally decided on in July 1933. And the draft for the law was written actually by one very prominent psychiatrist. And it was put into practice from January 1934 onwards. It was very open. There was nothing secret about that. And actually many physicians, in particular many psychiatrists, were very enthusiastic about this law. And from 1939 onwards, there was an even more radical policy against those who were deemed to be of minor biological value, namely the systematic killing, what was at that time called euthanasia, of 250 to 300,000 psychiatric patients, mentally handicapped, and further patients from marginal groups who were classified or diagnosed, namely by physicians, mainly by psychiatrists, as life unworthy of living. So we see here these two big programs for sterilization and systematic killing of psychiatric patients. Both programs mainly referred to psychiatric patients and mentally handicapped. There are two more subtopics for this whole field, namely the abuse of individuals defined as being biologically or legally of minor value, for psychiatric research or teaching. This occurred mainly in the context of the Second World War, that patients were used for psychiatric research or other medical research, where psychiatric patients were simply made available by psychiatrists. And the fourth subtopic is the exploitation and medical treatment of civil forced laborers in psychiatric institutions, including in university hospitals and university institutes like institutes of anatomy or biochemistry or physiology. All these institutions or hospitals used civil forced laborers. These were not Jews or politically unreliable people who were very early on sent to concentration camps. But during the war, there was a high severe problem of lack of labor force in Germany because most of the men were in the war at the front. So to sort of replace this labor force in the occupied territories, the Germans forcefully recruited the labor force people, and they were transferred to Germany to help in institutions or in contexts which were necessary for the war. That implies the production of war machinery, but also in the food industry and also in medical contexts. And these civil forced laborers, they lived in very bad camp-like accommodation, close to the places where they had to work. And many of them fell ill or had accidents. And so they had to be treated because they were needed as labor force. So there was some effort invested to help them, but only not to cure them, but just to make them able to work, to go on working. But the first step in this process of supporting, if you want, diseased forced laborers was to send them to psychiatrists, because the basic assumption was in all these cases that these laborers would either simulate their symptoms or they had inflicted wounds or whatever to themselves. So in order to clarify if they were simulate and so on, or if they had perhaps a psychiatric condition which led to self-destructive activities, they were sent to psychiatrists. So psychiatrists had a big role in that context. And there was quite an effort taken to adequately diagnose the situation, the condition of these persons. And there was also some effort undertaken to help them to that extent that they could go back to work. But if that was not possible, then they would be sent back to their country of origin, or if that was not possible anymore in the second half of the war, because the German army was on the retreat and had to give up the occupied territories, then these civil forced laborers were sent to the killing centers, which were before used for killing psychiatric patients. So, and we can see here that sort of the abuse of humans occurred all over the place in Germany in this context. And it was not only in concentration camps or in the occupied territories where there happened very terrible things, but it happened everywhere. And it happened also in university contexts. And many physicians, most physicians, were involved in this kind of injustice and abuse. Okay. Let me go one step further. If we look at what we know about the Nazi period and psychiatry, then we have to be very careful not to fall into a trap of sort of distorted images about the past, which have had a very long existence since the end of the Second World War. And my argument is that there are two main post-war myths on this period related to medicine and psychiatry in particular. Three myths with the function of exoneration of physicians and in particular psychiatrists. The first myth is medical atrocities in the Nazi period were committed by a few fanatic Nazi doctors. Essentially, they were the result of irrational ideologies imposed from outside Nazi politicians on supposedly non-political physicians. But that is a myth. Although it's a myth which is still used also in the States, I think, in certain contexts, that the politics is trying to intrude on the apolitical sphere of medicine, and that in the most extreme case, this will lead to conditions like in the Nazi period. This is, but sort of, it's a myth, it's nonsense. I will show you in a minute. The second myth, the programs of mass sterilization and patient killings, so-called euthanasia, which mainly concerned psychiatric contexts, both programs, as I said, were the expression of an ideology that had nothing to do with state-of-the-art medical reasoning and practice. This is also a myth, and I come back to that as well. And the third myth is the activities of medical scientists, including psychiatrists, experimenting on humans in concentration camps or in psychiatric asylums, had nothing to do with the questions and methodological standards of contemporary biomedical sciences, but were rather the expression of racial ideology or even individual perversion disguised as science, and should therefore be called rather pseudoscience instead of science. But this is also a myth. Well, let me confront these myths with the available historical evidence. The first myth, that there were only a few fanatic Nazi doctors who committed these atrocities, and essentially these atrocities were the result of irrational ideologies imposed from outside Nazi politicians on non-political physicians. But the historical evidence tells us something very differently. Practically all atrocious activities in medical contexts, that is, forced sterilization, patient killings, forced human subject research, were initiated by physicians themselves, including psychiatrists, and not by political instances. These medical activities were based on ideas, patterns of practice, and value hierarchies, which may be identified long before 1933, the Nazi takeover, also after 1945, and they may be identified also outside of Germany in the international medical community. An example would be the preference for the collective good versus the individual good, which we have in public health for some good reasons. But this kind of value hierarchy was taken to an extreme in the Nazi context, where this was perhaps the most important goal to priority the well-being, the health, the strength of the folk body, the Volkskörper, towards, this is the superior goal, and everything else has to be subordinated. But in general, we can say that, as I said, the ideas and patterns of practice and value hierarchies, which were taken to an extreme in this context, existed before, and they were not specific for this Nazi period. Also, in contrast to the assumption or the claim that the atrocities were committed only by a few fanatic Nazi doctors, cranks, freaks, we can state now that amongst the numerous physicians involved, including psychiatrists, there was a considerable number of professors from university medical schools, some of them already in office before 1933, some of them in office after 1945, that is outside of the Nazi period, who were involved in these atrocities. And there were also representatives of research organizations with international reputation, which were involved in these atrocities. Okay, second myth, the programs of mass sterilizations and patient killings which actually mainly occurred in the context of psychiatry, were the expression of an ideology that had nothing to do with state-of-the-art medical reasoning and practice. This is not true. The historical evidence tells us that the Nazi law enabling forced sterilization was a particular radical implementation of the programs of eugenics, or synonymously called racial hygiene, which had been formulated and propagated by physicians, biologists, and statisticians. Eugenics, as many of you will know, was an international movement with origins in the late 19th century. The term eugenics was coined by the statistician Francis Galton in 1883, and the term racial hygiene was coined by the physician Alfred Ploetz in 1895. Galton, the British, Ploetz, a German guy. Around 1930, that means even 3 years before the Nazi took over in Germany, there existed numerous eugenic associations internationally. Also, numerous research institutes in the States. For instance, the most prominent institute was at Cold Spring Harbor in New York, an institution, a research institution, which still exists today. It's now turned to an institution for research in molecular biology, but it was founded as an institution for eugenic research, eugenic genetic research. And there existed also eugenically motivated sterilization laws before the Nazis came to power. For instance, in more than 20 US states and in 3 Canadian provinces. And also the idea of euthanasia, killing euthanasia of life unworthy of living, was propagated by physicians and lawyers in Germany, but also in the US and the UK since the beginning of the 20th century. This was not unique for the Nazi context, and it was not invented by Nazi politicians. There were euthanasia associations, both in the US and in the UK, and there was a strong movement in Germany for legalizing the killing or the termination of life. The terminology was a little bit softer, the termination of life of those unworthy of living. The third myth, the activities of medical scientists experimenting on humans in concentration camps, psychiatric asylums, or also in hospitals of the occupied territories, had nothing to do with the questions and methodological standards of contemporary biomedical sciences, but were rather the expression of racial ideology or even individual perversion. This is, as I said, it's also not true. The historical evidence shows us that the research activities in concentration camps or in psychiatric institutions were in part initiated and organized by internationally renowned biomedical scientists, including neuropsychiatrists like Judith Hallervorden and Hugo Spatz, who described a neurological disorder in 1922 already, Hallervorden-Spatz disease, which is sometimes even called with that name, with that eponym today. They were involved in examining the brains of euthanasia victims, and in fact, they ordered children to be killed in the context of the euthanasia program to get their brains. Another example would be Ernst Rödin. He was the foremost psychiatrist in the Nazi period. He was the leader or the chair of the Psychiatric Professional Association, but he was also the chair of the International Federation of Eugenic Organizations. And he was the director of the elite institution of psychiatric research internationally at that time, which still exists today under the name of Max Planck Institute for Psychiatry. And Ottmar von Verschuur, he's a medical geneticist and also a eugenicist. And they initiated this research. So they were not nobodies and cranks, but they were highly esteemed international scholars in their fields. And for instance, Verschuur was in 1939, immediately before the Second World War. A few weeks before, there was the International Congress of Genetics in Edinburgh. He was invited to give a plenary lecture there on the method of twin research in medical genetics, because he was the leading figure for this method in contemporary medical genetics. And he was also, a side remark, he was also the doctoral supervisor of Mengele, and also the guy who initiated the research or some of the research which Mengele carried out in Auschwitz. We can also see that in many cases, the research questions addressed by these forced research programs in camps or in psychiatric institutions followed state-of-the-art knowledge. They were perceived by the historical actors as pressing in the context of war or also of racial policies. So they were directed at clarifying the genetic causes for a wide range of disorders. This was important for potential sterilization and so on and so on. So this was the broader context, and this was why lots of money was invested in, for instance, in genetic research, in particular in psychiatric genetics, because there were little other opportunities at that time to treat psychiatric conditions. But the idea was, if these conditions were really genetic in origin, we had a very, very effective means of prevention, namely sterilization. So that was one of the main reasons why psychiatrists were in particular keen to work in this field of eugenics and medical genetics. The methods used in these forced research, the methods used to answer these questions, research questions, were rational and coherent. They were not absurd and obsolete or whatever, but they were rational and coherent and sometimes innovative to answer the questions these historical actors wanted to pursue. So the problem with this research is not that it was outdated, that it was absurd, that it was nonsense in view of the questions which were asked or the methods applied. The problem was that the research practices were reckless and frequently brutal, in part deadly. Well, let me turn to another aspect, which will, in a way, then later feed into my general argument. I want to say a few sentences on the relationship between psychiatrists and the, as it was called, the new state, the Nazi state. There's a very interesting figure, namely that 55 to 60% of German psychiatrists were members in the Nazi Party. It's a very high percentage if you look at psychiatrists who are members in political parties today. Even in Germany, you would never have so many physicians or psychiatrists who are members in various parties, political parties altogether. But in that sense, it's a high number, but it is not 99%. Yeah, and this is very intriguing, I think. Namely, it has two implications. The first implication is that almost half of all German psychiatrists, namely 40 to 45%, were not members. That means that there was no necessity or even force to become a member, but becoming a member was the result of an individual decision and of individual responsibility. So what even I was told when I was young, my father was a physician himself, who was actually, I have to confess, a member of the Nazi Party. And when I asked, then I was told, and many others were told, well, you had to join the Nazi Party. There was no choice. But this is not true, as this simple number tells us. And therefore, this number is evidence for the scope of action and the possibility of choice, but also the fact that there is individual responsibility. And there was a scope of action, although there were very explicit expectations by those in power. There's no doubt about that. I mean, the expectations were clearly formulated, and you could read it in any newspaper, in speeches, and so on and so on. The expectations were clear, but nevertheless, almost half of German psychiatrists did not join the party, interestingly. And this was not because they were resistance fighters or so, but there were very different reasons for that. Interestingly, all is that the membership rate was higher in the group of younger psychiatrists, and in particular in those working in junior academic faculty positions. And it's very clear, you can see that from private letters of these young psychiatrists, diaries and so on, you can see that they decided to join the party because membership made a career easier. It's an expression of opportunism. It was not necessarily an expression or a proof of being a convinced Nazi. This does not mean that I want to apologize this kind of behavior. I think opportunism is a big problem, and it's a problem which is, I mean, much beyond the Nazi period. Yeah. But it's also true that, yeah, membership made a career easier, but there were possibilities of becoming appointed to a professorship or to be appointed to become the chair or the leader of a medical organization by non-members of the Nazi parties. This happened occasionally, not very frequently, but it happened. So there was not really a necessity to do that, but yeah, it seemed to be easier, and there were other career resources, if you want, open to you if you joined the party. The second implication of this rate of membership is that this rate is amongst psychiatrists and physicians much higher than in other academic professions. For instance, lawyers or teachers, also academic professions with in many ways similar profiles of work and employment and so on, they had a membership rate of roughly 25 to 30%. And this is in need of explanation. Anyway, it points to a specific affinity of physicians towards the Nazi regime, a much stronger affinity of the group of physicians and psychiatrists to the Nazi regime than that you find it in other academic professions. And there are three very likely explanatory factors, namely that the Nazi party promised a massive reduction of the previous high unemployment amongst physicians in the late Weimar period. There was a very high employment, 25, 30% actually, for young physicians in particular. And the Nazi party fulfilled this promise once they came to power. They fulfilled this promise also because they kicked out Jewish and politically unreliable psychiatrists from their positions. And then the result was that there were lots of job openings. But they also created new jobs, in particular in the realm of hereditary health policies. Another explanatory factor is that the Nazi party, before they came to power in the various elections, before they promised that they would unify the previously fragmented medical profession and create new privileges for the profession in comparison to non-academic healers on the health market, which were a strong competition until 1933. But yeah, this promise or pledge of the party was also fulfilled, and this led to high satisfaction, one might say, amongst physicians and psychiatrists in particular, with the policies regarding job opportunities and so on. And there was a third factor, which is also not negligible, because you can see this again in private letters, diaries, and so on. This was that physicians and psychiatrists were very glad and happy and pleased that again and again leading Nazi politicians proclaimed that our politics is applied biology or medicine, and we need physicians, we need psychiatrists to implement our policies and to construct them actually and to justify them. So yeah, the physicians were publicly sort of appreciated, yeah, and this is certainly an important factor as well. So one step back, there existed a scope of action for psychiatrists. And they were not, what they did was not the result of external force or simply the result of external force, although of course there were very, very clear expectations, and there were, in a way, there was the threat of force in some respects, but in others there was, yeah, as I said, there was a scope of action. And I have explained that for the question of party membership. But you can see that also in the more severe respects and realms which led to atrocities, like the sterilization law. The law demanded the notification of regional hereditary health courts, which were created actually into new positions for physicians in these health courts. They had to decide if a single individual would be sterilized or not. And so physicians in private practice, but also in public service, in schools, in school physicians, in hospitals, and so on, they had to notify these hereditary health courts if they encountered patients with potential hereditary conditions, like depression, or someone who just, you know, got unconscious. There might be a case of epilepsy, and then this could be a genetic form of epilepsy or an exogenic version. This had to be clarified, and it was clarified in a kind of expert opinion and examination of those cases. But first of all, the law demanded the notification of these cases. And there's a very, very interesting study which shows, it's referring to a Bavarian district around Erlangen-Nuremberg. There's also a university medical school. And it shows that between 1934 and 1939, that is in these 5 years, 2/3 of all physicians in private practice did not send a single notification to these hereditary health court. Although it's extremely unlikely that they didn't see cases of depression or you know, people who just had, yeah, potential epilepsy and so on and so on. And there occurred no sanctions to these physicians. Nothing happened to them. Although the staff of the hereditary health courts, they realized that there's internal communication. It's written down, and you can see that they realized that there was no notification. Nothing happened to these. So you can see that there is an individual decision of these physicians who said, I don't notify the hereditary health court. And this is in contrast to physicians in public health service and also the psychiatrists at the Erlangen University medical schools, who were, of course, also in public service. And they notified the hereditary health courts. So we can also not explain this by maybe the idea that in this area, a large proportion of all physicians or psychiatrists were sort of in kind of opposition to the regime or something. Not at all, because there actually the party membership was about 75%, so higher than in the average of Germany. But there must be other reasons to explain that those physicians in private practice did not notify the hereditary health courts. And this is the most interesting actually result of this study, is that the non-notification did not happen for humanitarian reasons. You can see this again from internal private letters, diaries, and so on. but rather because of the physicians' worries that their patients might choose another physician once they realized that they could be, or that this physician would notify the hereditary health courts, and patients would then be invited for scrutiny and so on. So this was out of self-interest that the non-notification occurred, not out of humanitarian reasons. Interesting case. Well, let's turn shortly to the patient killings or euthanasia program. And here one example, one of very few, unfortunately very few examples, is Gottfried Ewald, who illustrates the scope of action which existed. Ewald was a professor of psychiatry and neurology at Göttingen University. He was a committed eugenicist and proponent of the sterilization law. But when he was asked to work as an expert advisor and expert referee for the selections, for the patient killings, he refused that. And he tried also to prevent the deportation of patients of his hospital for killing. He also wrote letters of protest to various functionaries, including the Minister of Law, he experienced no sanctions. He was partly successful in trying to prevent the deportation of his patients. So, and he experienced no sanction. Actually, he was in office until the early 50s, so well beyond the Nazi period. Nothing happened to him. So this case illustrates that disobedience was possible. You had just sounds very easy and simple, but it's, of course, it is not. But you had to, have some kind of civil courage, or to do something like that, and to take some risk, of course, because in the situation he did not know what would happen if he wrote these letters and so on. Well,
okay, if I could just, you asked me to tell you when there was about 10 minutes left, so just.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So here, I just want in general to argue for a change of framing, that the atrocities were not the result of political pressure, but of psychiatrists' initiative. And I don't want to go through this. And I come to my starting points for reflections and implications for today. Psychiatrists and psychiatry as such were not simply victims of external political pressure. Rather, they were co-responsible for the atrocities, if not their initiators. And I've said all that. I just skip it. Simply pointing to politics as the culprit for the atrocities is inappropriate and disguises the core responsibility of psychiatrists and physicians more generally. But I don't want to sort of play down what happened there, not at all. But the Nazi context, and I don't want to play down the Nazi context, because this created the necessary preconditions to turn the already existing ideas and destructive potentials of psychiatry and medicine into a radical manifestation. So what might be conclusions and challenges and tasks for psychiatrists today? I have a few points here. First, create awareness for the available scope of action, even in difficult situations. I think for me, this is one of the most important things. Try not to accept pressure and the claim that there is no possibility and no scope of action, that things have to be done as they are, but always try to find out what is the scope of action, even under pressure. Reflect on the temptations and seductions creating conflicts with professional standards. And of course, and this is very important, attention for and fight against stigmatization and discrimination of victim groups known from history, in particular psychiatric patients, the mentally handicapped or challenged individuals, those tagged by racist labels such as Jews, Sinti and Roma, Muslims, etc. And Richard Horton, the editor-in-chief of the Lancet, several times said in public and in very much with very much resonance that physicians actually should engage in the political arena against racism, xenophobia, and health inequalities, because racism is a major public health problem. This is his argument. My final point is that there's a central sentence in the Geneva Declaration of the World Medical Association. This declaration in itself is a response to medicine during the Nazi period and to the Nuremberg medical trial. And this sentence is, I will not permit considerations of age, disease or disability, creed, ethnic origin, gender, nationality, political affiliation, race, sexual orientation, social standing, or any other factor to intervene between my duty and my patient. I hear that, oh, well, this Geneva Declaration is very general and it's not relevant in our Western context. It might be relevant to admonish physicians in non-Western context to keep to these rules, but here it's not really, I mean, it's trivial and self-evident. But I would argue this is not self-evident, as illustrated in the COVID pandemic, but it needs continuous efforts to put this pledge or norm into everyday practice. Okay, more information you find in these publications, one specifically on psychiatry, and the other one is the publication, the publicized version of the Lancet Commission on Medicine, Nazism, and the Holocaust. That's it. Thank you very much.
Volker, thank you very much. We do have some minutes if anybody has questions or comments or observations. Juan, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. So thank you for your presentation, Dr. Roelcke. So I was hoping that you can comment on the impact. What's your view of the impact of research, medical and psychiatric research, in societies that do not provide uniform, high quality medical care as a right, and the possibility that some people only have access to high quality care, potential high quality care in research contexts?
I'm not sure if I understand this your question correctly. You would argue, I understand that you think that high quality medical care or psychiatric care may depend on the access to research programs.
Yes. I mean, that possibility, whether, there's always the possibility that, in research, you as a patient have potential access to better care.
Yes.
But that's not my question. My question is whether there is an interaction with the fact that some countries have, or some societies have, better standards of care for everybody versus other countries that have, people pay for their care depending on their resources. And some people have less access to care than others.
Yes. And certainly, I mean, this situation, the latter situation you describe, is the reason for patients to join research projects if they can, but this makes them also vulnerable in some cases to, because they have a special, they are very dependent on the physicians and also perhaps the drug companies who provide these access to trials, and they may be used or even abused in these contexts. And that is something which I can see a continuity from the Nazi period in the post-war period, that patients are used also in clinical trials, vulnerable patients, and vulnerability can also be a result of bad healthcare. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question. Okay.
Natalie?
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. It was extremely informative and something that I personally had not known too much about before, so thank you. I was wondering if there's many accounts or knowledge about the folks that were not partaking in this or were kind of actively resisting some of these norms. Was there organizing done by those folks? Do we have a lot of accounts of like how they navigated that or what like lessons learned or ways that they stayed true to their convictions like during this time when there was a lot of individual consensus in the other way?
This is a very interesting question, and unfortunately we know very little because there are so few cases who resisted, and all what we know, I mean, seems to show that these acts of resistance, which I mentioned, some of which I mentioned, were sort of very much situated in a very specific context. They were not continuous actions, but they were just in a very specific situation when they were requested to do something, or they were asked, or they were expected to do something that they didn't do it. But there was no way of organization, in particular not of medics. I mean, there were a few resistance groups and very few physicians joined these more general resistance groups. But physicians were, at large, they were very, very conservative and also, in the beginning at least, quite enthusiastic about the regime. So whereas the resistance groups, they were mostly coming from a leftist, communist background. And so there was a kind of hesitancy, I would say, of physicians joining these resistance groups. And and there was no systematic efforts to, to maneuver through the whole period and create a consistent behavior or something like that.
In the last 30 seconds, I think one of the fascinating empirical findings that you presented was that the junior doctors joined at far higher rates than the more established physicians, and that it was something of a career ladder, I imagine, rather than a buy-in to the ideology. So that's useful to me, but it also suggested that there was stasis, career stasis for physicians and particularly psychiatrists, and that this was one way around that.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, Volker, thank you so much for presenting, and please everybody check the chat room, and hopefully the Lancet Commission report will be there. And please read some of the articles that Volker has written in your own leisure. So thank you all, and see you next time.
Thanks very much also to you, and whoever is interested and has more questions also may, of course, write to me an email or so, and I will be happy to respond. Thank you very much.